Well, I have the great privilege of getting our conversation going. I am reminded, Mr. President, that our mutual friend Bono once said, if you rock stars can't be presidents, but we should all be grateful that presidents can be rock stars. So we're grateful to you for being that kind of rock star. You talked about government and you talked about what you did. We talked a lot today about innovation. And I think people are disheartened about the idea that government really can be innovative. When all of the forces sort of push against it, how can governments either capture or recapture the kind of innovation that's going to be necessary in this even more complicated century?
Well, one thing I think that you have to create a culture of change, and you have to realize that even those of us, especially those of us who consider ourselves progressives who believe in government, we have to recognize that the danger that we live with every day is that if you have a monopoly on revenues and a monopoly on customers, you will get too complacent. The danger we live with every day is in America, for example, where median family income after inflation was $2,000 lower on the day before the financial crisis crashed than it was the day I left office. People in government want to pick up the slack naturally by at least making public employment more secure, giving them better wages, giving them better health care, giving them better retirement. But if you overdo that, then even though it looks like you're promoting justice, you won't have enough money yet left to create the future. And if we don't want the blind anti-government ideology to wreck things, then we have to be the instruments of positive change. And there are all kinds of ways to do that, but I think that's the most important thing. I think we have to realize that government has to be in the process of continuous innovation, but then when they do it, they ought to get recognized for it. I'll give you just one more example from the United States. An Indian-American doctor, Atul Gawande, who is literally a brain surgeon, worked for me in the White House and later became a highly regarded journalist. Many of you have probably read his articles in the New Yorker and elsewhere. But he still practices medicine. He wrote a wonderful book, which at least the Americans here should read, called The Checklist Manifesto, arguing that many of the cost problems in American healthcare were also quality problems, and that you could actually improve the quality and lower the cost if simple systems were put in place. The most important of which is to get everybody to wash their hands properly at least 5 different critical stations in a hospital journey, because we lose somewhere between 50 and 100,000 lives a year and spend $40 billion or more a year in hospital readmissions due to infections acquired in the hospital. And Atul participated in a 5-hospital, 4-nation test, including one hospital that was in a very remote part of Africa, where they just did this, and every place, from the poorest to the richest place, the results were exactly the same. Big plummeting in infections. Guess what the first hospital network in America was to implement the rule? Not just to order it, to implement it and to train all of its professionals to do it. The Veterans Administration Hospital Network, a government program. So you can do this, but you have to create a culture of service, and you have to involve the employees in it so they don't see themselves at odds with the taxpayers, and they understand you have to harmonize the desire to be as socially just as you can today with the people who work for the government and still leave enough money left over to invest in the future without making taxes too high.
Let's kick this up to the global level. When the US financial crisis hit and now the European debt crises, there are many who argue that globalization is uncontrollable and that there really is no overarching order that will ever be able to address our interconnectedness, both social, economic, and political interconnectedness. Is there a way to reimagine a global governance?
Yes. Keep in mind that the global system is emerging in fits and starts in different places. The fundamental problem you had is we developed a global financial system before we had a global system to regulate finance. We developed a global trading system before we really had a grip on leaving countries space enough to develop their own capacities, including poor areas and wealthy countries as well as developing countries. And we developed both before we had a global commitment to education, health, and other standards, which is what the Millennium Development Goals were all about. But if you think about it, the Global Fund on HTB and malaria and Gavi and a lot of these other things, they're global systems designed to allow the people who have money to make investments in trying to make life chances more equal for people throughout the globe. And they're a good model about where we need to go. I think the so-called Basel Accords on the uniform banking systems you can quarrel with them, but essentially, while the specifics of the financial crisis in the US, the UK, and Ireland and Iceland are different, if you really look at what went on, the bubble got too big because the financial institutions could become over-leveraged. That is, they loaned too much money with too little capital to back it up. Look, everybody makes mistakes. That's what that book, Being Wrong, is about. What you have to do is to understand that you want a certain play in any system so you can maximize the opportunity, but you've got to have a break. There was no break. So that's the sort of thing we need to do. The other thing I think is going to be a challenge for us now, that's what the Kyoto Accord was supposed to be and why we're trying to create another one. The reason that we hadn't gotten another one is that only 4 countries are sure to make their Kyoto targets. But it's worth me saying this because we now have more interest in sustainable environment in developing countries by far than we did in '98 when we did Kyoto. It is 44 of the richest countries had to meet specific targets. The only 4 we're sure are going to make it are Sweden, Denmark, Germany, and the UK. Before the meltdown, they were sure. And before the meltdown, which hit the UK especially hard because of its reliance on finance and banged up the Swedish manufacturing sector pretty well, all of those countries had lower unemployment rates and higher growth rates and less inequality than the United States because they made a decision to change the way they produce and consume energy. And I have spent a lot of the last 10 years in an often fruitless effort to persuade people in the developing countries the same thing would happen. I was down in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which is a roaring country now, but it's one of the biggest cities in the world. And they have, at their 2 biggest landfills, they have put up electric generating facilities to stop the methane gas emissions and to use the waste that cannot be recycled, which creates a ton of jobs for poor people, the recycling operation, as a power source. So what we need to do is figure out a global facility to finance positive goods in developing countries and a global system to stop the kind of risk that's swept across the world. The president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, had the courage to say what I have tried to say repeatedly, which is in 1981, the United States and the World Bank made a horrible mistake. We decided that all these poor countries could skip agricultural development and go right into an industrial era. And oh, by the way, it helped Europe and Canada and the US with subsidized agriculture to flood the markets of all these poor countries. It broke the Haitian rice crop capacity, for example, something I'm eternally regretful about. Now we're trying to recreate sustainable agriculture every place we can. The places we work in Africa, Dr. Farmer and I have done a lot of work on healthcare in Africa, but every Rwandan farmer we've worked with has at least doubled their income, and most of them have tripled their income. We can do this. That's why Bill Gates' decision to spend $100 million on this is good, but it's hard to systematize. That's the last point I want to make. All the best things that need to be done are economically viable, but more organizationally complex. For example, it's better for every utility in America to retrofit all the homes and buildings, but it's easier to hire one guy to build a coal-fired power plant and then go to one regulator to get permission to charge the ratepayers for it. So what we have to get comfortable with the complexity of numbers if the system itself is simple and repay itself. That's Eunice's great genius with microcredit. I remember one year when all those two factions in Bangladesh, which, you know, they'd make a great reality TV show in America, the way they fight with one another. But when they virtually ground the country to a halt politically, in total paralysis, worse than what we're going through now, and they still had 6% growth because he had reached a critical mass of microcredit, replicating little things by the millions. That's why I love Kiva. That's why technology is important, because it makes everybody powerful, and it means we can make millions of decisions that have a more sensible impact than one big one.
Mr. President, let's go from the economy to conflict. Again, I think we see so many conflicts around the world that appear unresolvable. Some ultimately get resolved, but without so much murder and genocide. Could they be resolved? And an interesting piece in The Economist quite recently outlined how independent organizations, rather than government, are increasingly playing a more significant role in mediating really significant international conflicts. Do you think this is a positive change in the business of conflict resolution? Do you think it is possible for NGOs or other kinds of organizations to actually broker lasting peace? Or again, is that the role of government?
Oh, I think, yes, I think it's possible, and I think some places it'll work better, because if any government that gets involved has got a history which may prejudice one or the other side against it. And governments may be worried about failure, which is always a problem, which means they may not go all the way and, you know, moving enough people there to work through it. And people may be worried about their own constituents, accusing them of selling out to the United States or the EU or somebody else. So I think I think the government should continue to work for peace. I had this discussion with President Bush once, and he said, you bled all over the old city of Jerusalem. You know, you could draw a map of Jerusalem in your sleep, and you still couldn't get this done. Why should I waste time on it? And I said, because fewer people will die. Whenever we're involved, fewer people will die, and the more people that die, the harder it is in the end to make peace. So governments are important, but NGOs can make a big difference, particularly if they, for one thing, they can get around so much easier. They don't have all this, you know, they don't have to carry armed retinues of security people. They can stay longer. They're not too proud to meet with anybody. They're not going to be accused of imperiling the security of the country if they talk to somebody who's persona non grata by the government. And the government may have done the right thing by making these people persona non grata, but it makes it more difficult for then our people to work with them. So I think that we're moving, I'll say again, into a blended world, and networks of cooperation will be necessary to solve all problems. And I think a lot of these problems can be solved. I mean, after all, look at the Irish situation. The people sitting over there at that table, all in their different ways, supported the resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland. But the politicians will be the first to tell you none of us could have done anything if the people weren't already there. They decided they wanted the benefits of a normal life more than they wanted to keep fighting one another. They looked at the Irish Republic and they saw it booming and prospering. And they looked at their kids and they didn't want them deprived of things that they knew were within their grasp. And the politicians finally found a way to work through all the emotional and other detritus that builds up when you fight people for a long time, and they got to where they needed to be. NGOs can go in and get at that in a hurry and find out where the deal is, where the psychic as well as the political and economic turning points are.
Let me turn to the private sector. One of the extraordinary things that you've done at CGI is really deeply engaging all of the sectors in these kinds of collaborative innovations that we're all talking about. How do you see the private sector transforming itself as it gets more engaged in these kinds of issues, working towards human progress? What is it learning that may be making its own performance different, even in their own businesses and financial? So not corporate social responsibility, but are you seeing practices or ideas that they're finding transformational as a result of working with you and with others in CGI and in these issues?
I think, first of all, the more companies become involved with countries all around the world, the more they look for ways to benefit the society as a whole in ways that fit with their business model, that is, that are almost necessary for them to do better. For example, I remember when Coca-Cola started in Africa testing people for HIV and AIDS and telling them nobody's going to be fired, everybody's going to get medicine, you'll be able to live. Why is that? Because we were reaching the point when this epidemic was out of hand in some places where big companies were hiring 2 people for every 1 vacancy because they assumed they needed to train 2 because one of them was going to die pretty soon. So I think that there was this thing. I'll give you another example. When Walmart decided that it was going to try to become the most sustainable big company in the world, most people thought, this is crazy. This has got a reputation as this real conservative company. But they figured out they were going to save a fortune if they cut packaging by 5%. And, oh, by the way, had the same greenhouse gas effect as taking 211,000 diesel-burning trucks off the road. Michael Porter, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, has just written, or at MIT, has just written the lead article in the last edition of the Harvard Business Journal, arguing that corporations that are really thinking about the future are moving completely away from the corporate social responsibility model into thinking about having a business plan driven by shared value. The idea that they simply can't last over the long run unless the value of what they do is shared not only with their shareholders, but with their employees and their communities, and in a larger sense, with the environment to be sustainable. And he said, once you start thinking that way, you find all kinds of clever ways to actually make money doing the right thing.
We talked, and this is the last question today, about building scenarios for those things that are unpredictable as a way of building better preparation. What do you see on the horizon when you look in your crystal ball about the kinds of challenges that we're going to be facing 20 years from now or 50 years from now that we ought to be thinking about today? And let me take climate change off the table and ask whether there are others that you think we're not focusing on enough that really will be profound challenges.
Yeah, I think you're going to have challenges in places that aren't poor, like poor people are facing today, if the global population growth continues, and if you have the same resource squandering, and if you continue to have a tug of war over proper investments in the future. For example, China could be derailed by something nobody's talking about. The Yellow River is now dry at significant times of year. So we're worried about the sea levels rising and the Yellow River drying up, and the Yellow River and the Yangtze are just as important to the culture, the history, and the eco-structure of China as the Tigris and Euphrates are to Mesopotamia. And so they have 2 choices. They can decongest the places that are overutilizing the river and build a whole network of new cities at a more scalable rate where it's sustainable, or they can do what they're apparently thinking about doing, which is to find 2 points where the Yangtze all the way to the Yellow is higher and building elaborately constructed canals where gravity will take water from the Yangtze down to the Yellow River. A lot of Chinese conservationists have been quoted in the press without being punished politically, I'm proud to say, saying they believe there's a chance this will dry up both rivers and totally derail China's progress. This is something nobody's thinking about now, but this could happen everywhere, this sort of thing. If you look at the problems we had with sanitation that caused the cholera epidemic in Haiti, yes, a Nepalese soldier apparently had his waste get into a stream in Haiti, and he had a strain of cholera in his body that they'd never had before. So Haiti's had everything hit it but a plague of locusts and cholera. Now they got cholera. But that's not really what caused it. What caused it was they had no sanitation system. And yet we now know there are decentralized, highly affordable, extremely efficient sanitation system where the properly treated human waste can also be put to an economic benefit. I believe that in the 20 to 30 years from now, even if you leave climate change to the side, we will, if we want to continue to accommodate both more people and a higher standard of living, we will become a reuse rather than a first-use society, because we will reach the limits of being able to just gobble up all these trees and see all these animal species go away and do all this. But so that's what I think. I may be wrong about that, but that's what I think. The other things I think will work themselves out. I think the innovation of young people, I think the empowering nature of the internet and cell phones and technologies yet to be understood will allow the newer generation of people either to change government policies and the private sector behavior or get around them in ways that will allow them to flourish. But we are here sharing this little planet. And even if the worst predictions of climate change don't come true, we are going to have to become more of a reuse than a first-use society. We're going to have to be clever about how to generate wealth without consuming more resources that are critical to all of our prosperity and endurance. I also think if the major promises of the Human Genome Project began to be manifest, we already know the genetic variances, for example, that make young girls more likely to get breast cancer. So women can wait till 50 to have their first mammogram unless they have one of these variances, in which case they should start at 30 or younger. That's really what the AMA should have said. It was all right to raise the age, except for the women with the variants. Think of all the things that are likely to come out of this. Unless we have done more to equalize healthcare systems throughout the world, it will only exacerbate the inequality which exists today, and we will increasingly be unable to defend why some children die and some children live just because of where they're born. So we have to find economical ways to do this that still leave either private companies or some public-private consortium with enough money to do the research and the development to keep breaking barriers. And I worry about this a lot. I mean, I just am obsessed with it. Every time I go to any place in East Asia or rural Latin America or Africa or, go into another neighborhood in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, I'm just hit between the eyes all over again that intelligence and ability and human worth are evenly distributed throughout the world, but opportunities are not. And the structures that reward good behavior with positive consequences are not. Unless we deal with this, that's like a hydra-headed monster that has an unlimited number of manifestations, and it will consume the future. And if we do deal with it, we're going to be fine. And if we deal with it in a way without consuming the planet. You've got to think about this. Even if you don't think climate change is going to happen, we've got to become a reuse society more and a first-use society less.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking a true world treasure, President Bill Clinton.